Hello, friends, and welcome to today's webinar on Native Americans and Christianity, which we are pleased to be offering in conversation with Reverend Chebon Kernell, who, among many other things, is the executive director of the Native American Comprehensive Plan of the United Methodist Church. So grateful for his presence with us today. This webinar is being co-sponsored by the Center for Ecological Regeneration and the Stead Center for Ethics and Values. A quick reminder on technology, because this is a webinar, those of you joining us will be seeing only the featured presenters. So we hope you will use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit comments or questions along the way. And we'll make sure to leave time toward the end of our conversation today for those questions. Today's webinar is the second in a series of 6 webinars that'll be offered monthly through the end of this academic year, offered as part of the work of Garrett's Indigenous Study Committee, which we'll hear more about shortly. So I'm Tim Eberhardt. I direct the Center for Ecological Regeneration at Garrett, which is aimed at spreading regenerative eco-theological understandings, restorative earth-based religious and spiritual practices, and cooperative solidarities for the just healing of both social and ecological relationships in the Midwest bioregion and beyond. If you'd like to receive communications from the center, you can sign up on the main web page. You can also learn more about the launch of the center last April in our Field Notes newsletter. Both links are in your chat. So I'm now happy to introduce the Reverend Dr. Stephanie Perdue, who will be joining me as one of the co-chairs of the Indigenous Study Committee to dialogue with Reverend Kernell today. Dr. Perdue is an associate conference minister of the Illinois Conference United Church of Christ and an affiliate faculty member at Garrett in the field of history. Dr. Perdue, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, is a sought-after teacher and speaker in Native American history and culture, and currently serves on the board of directors of the Mitchell Museum of the American Indian here in Evanston, Illinois. Before turning to her, I'd like to call your attention to Dr. Perdue's recent article in the Christian Century on land acknowledgements. Dr. Perdue.
In May 2022, the president of our seminary formed our Indigenous Study Committee and commissioned us to research past and present realities of Garrett-Evangelical's impact on and relationship with the Native peoples of our bioregion. He asked that our committee research decolonial Indigenous theological perspectives and practices, consult with appropriate tribal, denominational, and institutional leaders, provide a truthful accounting of historical record, explore potential future partnerships with Indigenous-led organizations, and propose concrete recommendations to the seminary for reparative actions. Our report to the seminary's leadership is due in May 2023, and our committee has been meeting monthly since last May. This webinar and last month's webinar with Dr. Randley Woodley are part of our work as we seek to share Indigenous theological and perspectives and practices with the wider GETS community. So you know a little bit more about our work. Tomorrow, members of our committee will meet with representatives of regional Indigenous-led organizations to explore potential future partnerships, and that gathering is being held by and hosted by our friends at the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research at Northwestern University. You can learn more about all of our work. You can read the bios of our distinguished committee members at our committee's webpage. And now I'm very happy to introduce to you Dr. Kate Ott, who is the director of the Stead Center.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Perdue, for your co-leadership of the Indigenous Studies Committee, and Dr. Eberhardt for this collaborative opportunity between the STED Center and the Center for Ecological Regeneration. Reverend Kernell, we are so grateful to you for your generous sharing of time and wisdom with us today. As has already been said, I'm Dr. Kate Ott. I'm the director of the STED Center, where we seek to enhance moral communities by addressing relevant, critical justice issues, one conversation at a time. You can find out more about our work online at thestedcenter.com, which all of the links we're addressing today have been posted in the chat, and we will continue to keep up with that throughout the presentation today. We'll also share a follow-up written online article by Reverend Kernell in the weeks to come. And for those of you who might have missed it, we also have Reverend Dr. Woodley's article on decolonializing theological education from the first lecture in this series. I'll put that link in the chat as well. We look forward to not only having this conversation today, but the ongoing educational work that can be housed throughout our various web presences, where this article will also be posted, and the video for our recording today. I know many of you asked that in the chat as we go along. I would now like to invite Katie Fahey, the Garrett Admissions Officer, to share a welcome with all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ott and Dr. Eberhardt, for inviting me into this space. We are so excited that you are here today, and I know that this event is going to be so transformative for you. I am simply here to share with you that if this event is exciting for you, if it leaves you with more questions than answers, and if you feel led to learn more, then Garrett is here for you. Garrett offers a variety of options for learning, from enrichment courses all the way through doctoral degrees, and we offer courses in a variety of modalities too. So whether you're near or far, you can learn from and with us. If you get to the other side of today's event or this series of events and you would like to continue exploring theological education, I would encourage you to reach out to us in the Office of Admissions at Garrett. Our team can help you discern what your next steps might be. You can reach out to us via getadmitted@garrett.edu. Check out our website to learn more about our degree programs, scholarship opportunities, and admission deadlines. And I'll turn it back to Dr. Perdue to introduce our webinar presenter.
Thank you. It is an honor to introduce the Reverend Chebon Kernell to the GETS community. Reverend Kernell is an enrolled member of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and is of Muskogee Creek heritage. And he is currently the executive director of the Native American Comprehensive Plan for the United Methodist Church. He has been an executive in the denomination for the past decade, and in his current role, he works with the World Council of Churches, the New International Financial and Economic Architecture, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the United Methodist Church's Council of Bishops, as he assists in a denominationally mandated effort to improve relationships with Indigenous people through dialogue, study, local or regional acts of repentance, acknowledging harms inflicted upon Indigenous communities. In addition, he spends his time raising awareness, increasing advocacy, and supporting the empowerment of Native American and Indigenous communities globally. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Oklahoma City University and his Master of Divinity from Phillips Theological Seminary. He is a cultural practitioner and member of the Healthby Ceremonial Grounds in Hannah, Oklahoma, and he has been married to his spouse, Sarah, for 22 years, and together they are the parents of 5 children, Casey, Josiah, Raylan, Solomon, and Kali. Chebon, welcome. We are so privileged to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Chebon, as both an ordained pastor in the United Methodist Church and someone who works as a cultural practitioner of traditional Native ceremony, as someone shaped by Christian beliefs and trained in Christian institutions, who at the same time is deeply committed to the recovery and the transmission of Indigenous beliefs and practices. You are well positioned, uniquely positioned, to speak to the complex relationship between Native American communities and Christianity, historically up to the present. And so to begin our conversation today, I wonder if you might share a bit about your own history, your own life story, and how you've come to inhabit and navigate these overlapping worlds in your own personal and professional life.
Absolutely, Tim, thank you. And you'll have to forgive me, is that I wanted to say this as my primary introduction. So forgive me, I'm gonna step back for a moment and just say these few words in my Muskogee language, just to acknowledge this moment in time. And I'll explain here shortly, because that is a part of the answer to the question that is being shared to me today. Is a Chebon Kernell, Chohotifkado, and Hadogi, Hadogogi, Amalegedon, Ombozit, Nogosogedos, Helobi Kanidia Delwa, Chogotako, and Tazakairois. I wanted to say that a little bit because it's a way of honoring my ancestors. It's a way of honoring our Indigenous peoples. And for me, on this special day, for those that may connect with me via social media, I kind of let it out yesterday, announced it, that today is my late mother's birthday. And for us as Muskogee people, we are matrilineal people, so that, you know, our entire cosmology centers around the role of the Indigenous woman in our community. And therefore we get our clan lineage from our mothers, from our grandmothers, all the way back to the beginning of creation. And today I was supposed to be on vacation, but I said, no, I want to do this in honor of my mother, but also in honor of all of those Indigenous women, all the way back to the birthing of humanity from this earth mother. And so that's what I shared, is that the Hadogogi people, Hadogogi is the wind people, the wind clan. And in those few little lines I shared, I also acknowledged my companion in life, who is Nogosogi, which is the bear clan. Because I do that, it's proper to respect this earth and our existence on it as we start our conversations. If we ever want to come to a way of understanding our existence in a healthier manner, and even in a more traditional manner, prior to contact with any colonizing entities, we have to start to understand our place in all of creation. And so that's how I do it, is by saying, this is who I am, and these are who the people that I come from, and acknowledging, and even in a sense, asking permission from this earth, if it's okay to do what we're doing today. And so that's why I wanted to just pause and do that, because, you know, in so many ways, you know, even as I sit here, I'm tugged in many directions. You know, I'm acknowledging that even I have relatives in what is now called the city of Atlanta, which is Muskogee homelands, where some of our forest defenders and protectors are actually being incarcerated because of simply wanting to preserve the largest urban forest in the United States. And there's a whole host of conversation going around that. And I've been in conversation with them to talk to people, anybody who will listen, about what does it mean to exist together in this world. And so I'm convicted by those things. And so today I at least acknowledge that to the energies of this earth and this earth mother, that this is who I am. And while I have been displaced from my homelands and have to travel back frequently, that I'm doing what I can to restore our way of life as Indigenous peoples. And that's what my hope is for everyone. Now, to get to the actual question, is that, I don't know, that there's a joke that goes around our communities that talks about Wind Clan, that they say, well, that kind of means that you're long-winded when you talk. And so people like to tease me a little bit. So I try not to go off into that direction of talking too much. But then also there's the double-edged sword, I guess you could say, is I'm also a preacher. And so they always say preachers always talk too much, as it is anyway. So I'm going to try to handle that as best as I can in our time together, because really it's been a long journey. In my 45 years of existence on this earth, I'm thankful that I have always been around my identity and my community, the cosmology that we have left intact. And maybe throughout the day, I'll explain what that means, intact. But I've been around our elders. I've been around our ceremonial communities, our tribal towns, that kind of thing. But there's always, as I was raised from a young person to college, that kind of thing, there was always a preference that you need to go to church. And even in many of our circles throughout Native American communities, there's really an identical almost theology that exists there. That there's always a sense of, this kind of understanding of what salvation can mean. Are you saved? Have you been baptized? Those are questions that I was surrounded by continually. And so, needless to say, I was a victim of those circumstances. While I had this ceremonial life over here, it wasn't my priority. It wasn't, being around my grandparents, asking them the deep questions that I wish I could have asked. But I even acknowledge today that one day I'll continue that conversation when I join them. But I had a preference for, well, I need to go to church. Even on my mother's birthday today, I still remember her banging on my door when I lived at home. Oh, it's time to get ready, that kind of thing, and telling me to get up and all of those kinds of things. There's that preference was there, and so this was kind of my understanding. Even as I went throughout my high school years and started preparing for college, I can even remember I was a person within the United Methodist structure. We have what we call youth groups that are for the regions, and I was one of our leaders, our president of our organization. And I can remember people at the age of 16, 17 saying, well, you're going to be a good preacher one day. You're going to be a good preacher. And I said, whoa. I said, back up. I said, that's not something that interests me. I just want to be honest. I want to be someone who understands, how to interact with people. And so I kind of was like, oh, needless to say, this kind of carried on into undergraduate studies, where the actual plan was to go to law school. I had already taken my entrance exams. I was actually gathering letters of recommendation, and I felt that I didn't think I would be content. There wasn't enough leeway, because even structures of law goes back to European precedent. And I was like, well, I don't know if that's something that's going to satisfy me, because that's not enough going back far enough. And so, needless to say, because of that influence, I said, well, I'm going to go to seminary, go to graduate school. And it was there, I just thought I was fulfilling what I believed was God's call. And, I switched everything up, enrolled, and got, was accepted into one of my more local seminaries, Phillips Theological Seminary. But it was through those studies that something cataclysmic happened, which I think happens to all of us when we go through theological education, when we start to analyze the history of Christianity, when we start to look at the history of something as simple as the Bible. I was around environments where there was very much the understanding of inerrancy, this kind of thing, word for word, verbatim. This is God's will for all of humanity. And when I went through those classes, I couldn't remember, like, oh my goodness, what do you mean? And I had a good conversation as an alumnus with my New Testament professor, Dr. Dennis Smith, the late Dr. Dennis Smith. And I remember sitting in his class, we were talking about Luke, Acts, and one of the questions was what the authorship of Luke. And I guess it was common knowledge to my fellow students that Luke didn't write Luke. I had never heard that before. What are you talking about here? And needless to say, that's when the change began. And I began to start asking those questions and say, wait a second, has the church and Christianity told me the whole truth in their interactions with me as an Indigenous person? And I realized that it hadn't been the case. And all heck broke loose when I started studying the history of Christianity. And when I realized when Spain and Portugal was in this massive pursuit to colonize other entities, so-called discovered countries, that there was an actual debate going on when they encountered indigenous peoples, if they were worthy of salvation, if they indeed had souls, and if they were indeed human beings at all. A debate. And I sit here, however many 1700 years later, 1600 years, whatever it is, and I say, like, you had no right to debate my ancestors. And in fact, I'm debating now whether our church has a soul or not, in quite honesty. And I've actually gotten standing ovations in communities for saying that. But when I realized that moment, I said, wait a second. From this point on, I'm going to do everything in my power to come back to who I am, that I was created to be as an indigenous person. And even I realized that may even mean someday even walking away from Christianity if I'm pushed out. And I'm okay with that, because God made me, the creator made me, this entity, this energy that we all have an understanding of made me who I am. And I'm not a mistake by no means, and neither are any of us across the world of indigenous peoples who have an understanding of life, who have a language, who have a cosmology and a spirituality that has been in existence for thousands of years. And at that moment is when I began that journey, and that was over 20 years ago. And so today I'm only a product of that recovery process. I was just so thankful, so blessed that I had parents, I had grandparents, I had elders that surrounded me as I began that journey, even as they scratched their heads like, oh, what do you mean? And they walked with me. And so I'm thankful today that my first identity is being a spiritual practitioner. I worship the ways that our ceremonial ancestors worshiped. I've raised my children that way. Now, I haven't demonized any other faith system, religious articulation out there. I simply say, here it is. This is who you are. And what is the path that you choose to go down? And so this is how we live today. Now, that doesn't mean I don't work within the church. I still preach, I'm still an elder within the United Methodist Church, that kind of thing. And needless to say, it is complicated. And I do hope to publish a book that will talk about what that struggle looks like and all the intricacies that was there.
Chebon, I'm struck by you saying that as those, historic explorers and church leaders were debating whether our ancestors were fully human, you were struck to be debating within your own self whether the church has a soul. And as I look around as a tribal citizen around the landscape in the United States, I notice that there is what I perceive as a growing interest in our spiritualities, in some of the cosmology and worldview and relationship with creation that you've already described, that is kind of embedded in our different tribal worldviews, stories, and traditions. And I also notice and wonder if you have noticed places where in the Christian church or outside of it, that interest veers into a kind of cultural or spiritual appropriation or borrowing, which itself sometimes feels like another aspect of colonialism. That not only was the land here free for the taking, everything is free for the taking. All wisdom is kind of free for the taking. And so I'm wondering, I expect that there are a lot of people on the call that are genuinely interested in tribal worldviews and cosmologies, genuinely interested in knowing how to best learn in an honorable way without veering into that space of appropriation. And so I'm wondering what wisdom you might have to share with us regarding that.
No, I thank you, Stephanie. I do have a couple of avenues that I want to go down as I think about the potential for appropriation. And I'm hoping that all of our participants and those persons who may engage this webinar somewhere down the road, they understand what that appropriation means. The taking of different pieces of an identity and a cosmology of a group of people and using it for other purposes. when the origination of that taking entity, they're not Indigenous, they're not Native American or Indigenous across the world. Because I really do think there's a misunderstanding, because there is that assumption, and I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it's the Enlightenment period or where, that people feel they have a freedom to take another's thoughts and identity and take them on as their own. So it's really a complicated thing, because when people ask me this question, and even as I think about it spiritually, I think about it as I am considered not just an elder in the church, but an elder in our community already. That I think to a deeper response, because something has happened in the history of the development of this country that people have not acknowledged as a whole yet. We're changing that every day. When we think about government institutions run boarding schools, residential schools, when we're thinking of US policy that took children out of homes, that placed them into these re-education centers, and even forbade them the wearing of clothing, the speaking of language, and the wearing of a hair a certain way. We weren't able to do that. And this goes all the way back to the 1800s that this process began. And I'm not so sure we're out of that assimilation process yet. When I see our languages and our dress and attire present in all schools across the United States, then I'll say maybe we're getting to the end of that, but I don't. We're still seeing English, even in my state of Oklahoma, every so often we get the English only legislation that is attempted to pass. But we have to realize that this is something that's been taken from us. And even some of my side work, I work with institutions and agencies as they try to wrestle with getting rid of Native American mascots. I've worked with some of our bigger organizations in Atlanta, different places, on saying, hey, there's no other group of people that you appropriate imagery, that you appropriate different things. And everyone keeps coming back and saying, well, we really want to learn. We really want to honor Native peoples. Why can't we do this? Well, we have not acknowledged that a lot of those mascot imageries began almost at a parallel time period when actual Native peoples were forbidden to have a drum, to live in an ancestral way, forbidden to do those things. Then you have the birthing of these other entities that were saying, well, we're going to take the freedom upon ourselves to dress like you did and make up our own vernacular even, and do these things over here parallel while you cannot do that. So there's like a double crime against humanity that is going on there. And we haven't even acknowledged that, because in this time period, you see these entities, these sports teams, high schools, you see the development of youth programs. I've worked with some of our programs across the country that, that talk about appropriating imagery and so-called ceremony. You see universities having these things all across the country. And even, I'm in conversations now with certain groups of scouting work that we can't find origins of where that connection came from. But they're all saying we're trying to honor Native people, all the while we can't even live. We can't even do these things upon ourselves. And so we have to acknowledge that. So before we come back to say, how do we live in a healthy relationship, we have to acknowledge that harm that has been done with that assimilation process. But then the second avenue that I want to go down is that there has to be some level of acknowledging cultures and communities that have been in existence for thousands upon thousands of years, that this experiment of the United States isn't something that has not proven the test of time yet. That all of the ailments that we see being evident, through the pandemic, through the political structure, everything through the economy, capitalistic economy that we see right now, they're all tests, and we're starting to see some of the fallacies that are in those ways of existence. When I go to my homelands in what is now the southeastern part of what is called the United States, I always have conversations with people, whoever might listen, universities, and I say, it is believed that human inhabitation in that part of the world has been around for around 16,000 years. And that even some of our mound structures that our ancestors, the ancient ones, were a part of, they tell us that this was our birthplace of our communities from the Southeast. And when I think about 16,000 years, I look at this country and it's just over, I think, 240 years old, something 247, something like that. That's what we have to acknowledge. So my hope is that how do we find that balance of a people that did exist for an enormous amount of time without doing harm to each other in a cataclysmic way, and without doing harm to this earth and what she provides for us in a cataclysmic way. And that's where I think we have to have the willingness to begin to communicate with each other. But here's the difference between appropriation and non-appropriation, is that in this day and time, in this moment, we still have Indigenous leaders. We still have practitioners of a way of life that, even though sometimes it might be fragmented, we still have those things that we're carrying on to the best of our ability. Hear and listen to those voices. Allow them the freedom to guide us in our existence. Don't take and say, well, now that I've studied this group of people, I'm going to teach this class over here, or I studied this group of people over here, and I'm going to write a book about you. I have a friend of mine when I was serving in the local churches who was of the Chickasaw and Kiowa, from their communities. We used to talk about, like, we had an elder, and we said, I don't know how many PhDs this person has assisted other people getting without getting the same acknowledgement. And so when we see the voices changing of who's talking, that's when I think we start engaging in appropriation. But allow us that moment to exist in a different way. Allow us that sense of, one of the characteristics of our way of life as Muskogee people that we always talk about is a sense of Eoskita, or humbleness, of understanding that we're not the only race on this earth. We're not the only species on this earth. And the things that we do, the footsteps that we take, are supposed to be so gentle that they don't interfere with other life that is there. Now that does mean, we did hunt, we still do hunt, we still interact, even prehistoric times there was war, but not the way we see it today, not with the massive elimination of the energy of life that we see today. And so this is what I'm hoping that our peoples can come to, a sense of not just equality and equity and justice, but acknowledging the reverence in each other, that, we have a right to exist, that, when we say we don't want a pipeline dug under our water source, that means something. When our elders come there, that means something. When we say we believe in the life of a tree and we don't want it cut down, it means something, because, our energies and the things that we have, it feeds us, it takes care of us. And we're starting to see in this day and age that first moment of the human species being harmed by the violence to this earth mother that has taken place right before our eyes. And we're even normalizing and justifying that violence at this very moment. And so my hope is that, I don't say that, we're not going to give out free passes to go and to do sweat lodge ceremonies, white buffalo calf woman ceremonies, our practices that we do, because there's things that I don't talk about in public at all. That's a part of our existence as Indigenous peoples. But what I do share is those common concepts of humanity that I think are okay. It's okay to say, is it all right if I have a conference in Chicago? I was at the World Council of Churches. I don't know what they call it. They're meeting every 8 years. That was postponed because of the pandemic in Karlsruhe, Germany. And they were asking me the same question: how do we respect Indigenous understanding? I said, well, before you had your conference here, did you go out and did you pray? Did you look at the sun that was coming up, that was bringing in this new day, and acknowledge that you're not entitled to that day, that the creator, God, or your understanding of God allowed you to be in that moment of time? And did you ask this Earth Mother for permission to bring thousands of people here and to know that, it's going to have an impact on her and that she would have to provide for them? Did you ask for forgiveness for the things that we might forget? Did you do those things? Anybody can do that. Anybody can pray. Anybody can be mindful of how to exist. I don't think that's appropriation. But we're in a world that re-indoctrinates us at every moment, from every commercial, from every TV episode, from all of these things to say, here's how you're supposed to be. And really, that's what's harming us the most.
A quick reminder to our webinar participants, you'll see the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to begin entering comments, questions, and sometime over the next 20-30 minutes, Stephanie and I will shift from our questions to yours as we continue to deepen our conversation with Chebon. Chebon, you already noted this, but I want us to turn back and spend some more time here. So over the last several years, more and more attention is being paid to the terrible history that you already referenced and the ongoing impacts of the boarding schools in the US. It's a history that involves not just the United States government and military, but also the active role of Christian denominations, their missions, agencies, and boards and efforts. And it involved the underlying theological beliefs that perversely justified this terrible separation of children from their families, this terrible organization of attempts to sever entire generations of Native children from their Indigenous heritage, right? And it was framed as in the name of progress or the march of civilization, and woven throughout this, the spread of the Christian gospel. What can you tell us about your own involvements? Because I know you're involved not just locally in Oklahoma, not just nationally in the US, but globally. What can you tell us about your involvement in raising awareness about this history? And how would you guide those who are participating in this webinar to be engaged in truthful but also reparative responses to this history?
I think, Tim, the first area is acknowledging that this history has taken place. And I think we corporately are still struggling with that acknowledgement. Now, we're at a moment, I'm not going to say that is greater in any other time in history, because this is something we should mourn. This is a time when something that we should lament. But more so than any other time, we're acknowledging the egregious nature that these schools were even, these boarding schools, these residential schools were even there. And the fact of the matter is, I acknowledge that I'm not so sure we would even be talking about it today if it was not for these discoveries of unmarked graves of children that are unnamed in First Nations communities of Canada. That if that did not happen, I'm not so sure that even our US government, under the leadership of Secretary Deb Haaland, would have had an opportunity to do their research over the past year and a half or so to help explain some of those that's there. So acknowledging that, even thinking about what it means for a policy of re-education to take lives, to go against the self-determination of a tribal community, of a family, of an individual, of a life out, to re-educate them into something that is foreign, something that is different. And even for me, as I think about that moment in time, I go all the way back to analyzing the populations of Indigenous peoples. And I try to bring that to the awareness of everyone. I think I've said that about 10 times at different presentations this year alone, is that when we think about, at one time in this continent, 100% of the population was Indigenous peoples. At one time, there were millions upon millions of Indigenous peoples. Now, depending on different rubrics of analyzing, I think some of the estimates, some of them are continental, some of them are the US only, different kind of things. Some of them are hemispheric estimates. It kind of just depends on what scholarship you're researching. But it's estimated anywhere between 10 million to over 100 million Indigenous peoples were here in existence for thousands of years. And even some of what I try to look at is that even some of the more recent scholarship out of the University of Wisconsin talked about 56 million, kind of a number in the middle. Well, it is believed that during that moment of relocation, dispossession of land, of Indigenous peoples, Native American peoples here in the US, that just over that collectively during that moment of the establishment of reservation systems, Trail of Tears stories taking us across the country into places. I mean, that's why I'm in Oklahoma right now, is because this was a massive reservation at one time. This is why there's 39 tribes that are located here at this moment in time. These aren't our ancestral homes. It is my home now, but it's not my ancestral home. That during that moment, it is believed that from war, from exposure, from loss of life, even some of us were taken into slavery as well, that just over 244,000 Native peoples survived. Collectively, they added us all up just over 244,000. So if you were to do the math, that means that Indigenous peoples, we lost 99.996% of our population during that moment in time. And it was at that exact moment that also the beginning of the 19th century and into most of them started mid 1800s, but the first school I believe was early, like 1802, 1807, somewhere around there, give or take a couple of years. But during that moment in time, that's when the boarding school process was birthed. So when we were at our most vulnerable state, when we were only at a percentage of survivors of 0.004%, then they instill this insidious policy of taking our children away, taking them away from our homes. And even we have to acknowledge, terminology like this was their final solution to the problem of, with the terms they use as Indian people. And we haven't come to terms in any ways to acknowledge that. We're still fighting. We have groups and families of survivors of these boarding school students who are going and raising money on their own so they can go and research sites on their own. They're being trained on their own on ground penetrating, how to use ground penetrating radars so they can do their examinations of the territories of the areas themselves, when it should be the churches, it should be the government. Because this is the other part of that question, Tim, is that the churches, we have not fully acknowledged our connection, our culpability in that moment in time. That there were some, and there was a report that was given out earlier this year that talks in great detail. No other report has ever been given in history about boarding schools until this year, I think May of 2022, where it talks about some of these schools were run by churches and denominations. That one of the things I've compelled the denomination that I'm a part of is to say, you have to give full disclosure of any connection that you may have as a denomination historically to these schools. And I'm thankful to say we're right in the middle of that, because I think all of our denominations should be able to say, this is how many students came, this is how many schools we had, this is the names of those students, these are the missionaries that were assigned to these institutions, and these are the amount of times that they were in place, and this is the amount of money that we put forward. Nobody can say that. The US government can't even say that. In fact, one of the horrific items that came out of that report back in May from the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs was that even monies that were being held on behalf of Native American people in trust accounts were actually used to fund some of these schools. So there's kind of another double-edged sword. So today, my hope is that by just acknowledging that, having compassion to realize that this has started that intergenerational trauma that we're still trying to recover from, a moment of existing that it takes time. And that's really how I see my work, is that for us, I believe that we're putting the pieces back together of our identity. Whether, how do we understand spirituality? How do we understand identity? Everything that was indoctrinated us and still is being indoctrinated in us as Native peoples, that we start to remember who we are. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't have a conversation about this intentionally with my family and my household here, because it's past time that we have to acknowledge that we weren't always told the truth about who we are. And so my hope is that, we acknowledge this, but then we even start understanding, what does restitution look like? What does reparation look like? How do we engage the elders that are survivors of this moment in time? How do we engage a sacred cosmology that is being embodied, not in books or diplomas or academia, but in the hearts of Indigenous peoples who have gone out and done ceremonies even when no one was around? And I'll give you, a small example from my own life, is that one of the things that we don't know all the reasons why, but we know that on the first snowfall of the year, we go out and we cleanse ourselves, we wash ourselves as if it was medicine. And so we made sure that we're able to do that. Sometimes there's no fanfare, there's nothing written in books. It's just what we know from our cultures, from our grandparents, from those that have passed it on. And so we still do that to this day as a way of taking care of us, preparing us for the cold. And even here in Oklahoma, we've already done that. But just doing those things, because that's who we are as Indigenous peoples. And that small example of washing is just one of probably a million different things that we have inherited as Indigenous peoples that may not, we may not even know we're doing it, but we do it. So that's what my hope is that before we're only a memory in the community memory of this country, we have that right to exist and live as we see, in hopes that our children, our grandchildren, and the generations to come will still have this way of life. Because obviously something was right about it, because we have been here, we have survived that. Everything about those schools, everything about this country, we're still here. And to be honest, our understanding, and all the Indigenous peoples I've communicated with across the world, I don't think I've ever come across a cosmology that is exclusive to say you have no right to exist the way that we were treated. I haven't heard anyone say that. I've heard different pleas, different teachings that talk about respecting each other's existence and the reverence of each other. But it goes back, it always points back to how we are all just one species upon this earth. And so that's what my hope is, that we can build that together. I will say, though, that because colonizing entities are still at work, they do still parallel with extractive industries, that there are instances across the world where re-education centers for children are still being established today. And so my hope is that anytime we start to see that we will always give resistance. We will always start to acknowledge the truth. And even if we don't know what the answers are and where do we go, be honest about that and say, well, I'm not sure what we do, but just acknowledge that we strive for a world where that does not exist, a time where we don't have that type of harm, where we respect the self-determination of our individual communities of existence. And I do think we are getting some traction. When that report came out, there were news stories across Oklahoma that carried it, on the evening news, that kind of thing, whereas there was a day and time when that would have never happened. I will say that this is something that I have continually talked about, in my entire career. And I can remember in another lifetime when I was a local church staff member, I remember speaking in a church here in Oklahoma, and someone came up to me. I taught US history for 40 years, and I never heard about boarding schools. I never knew about them. And right there, that's exactly the problem, is that we're hoping to remove that historical silencing of our voices in hopes that we can grow together for a better world, a better country for all of us.
I'm struck by a couple of things. First, really your conviction, which is something we claim to know in the church, which is that the first step in repentance or reparative action is confession, and that we need not be afraid of telling truth, because it's only in that telling of truth that we truly become more free. And so you've been narrating some various chapters of truth in the history of the United States and in the history of this country's founding and settling and relationship with native tribal nations in this land. And as you've narrated that, you've intersected with federal United States Indian policy, from the policy of removal to policies centered around assimilation. And as you also noted, colonization still goes on. This is not over in this country. So I'm thinking that some of our participants may be aware of a current case before the Supreme Court. On November 9th, the Supreme Court heard arguments in a case called Brackeen versus Holland. And it's a case somewhat related to the boarding school story, in that it's a case that's challenging what we call the Indian Child Welfare Act. The Indian Child Welfare Act did come about as a way of recognizing that the United States had had policies of removing Native children from their homes, from their tribal communities. And the Indian Child Welfare Act is in place to protect Native children. And should there be a fostering or adoptive situation needed, place them with their tribe, because the tribe is a sovereign nation. And I think as this case unfolds, there is some confusion even among the Supreme Court justices about what it means that there are 500 and some tribal nations within the United States who have a government to government, citizen to citizen relationship with the United States. So when people read about this case, the argument of the plaintiffs is that to say that a white couple can't adopt a Native child is a racial discrimination that should not exist, that is unconstitutional. The argument of the tribes and of the Secretary of the Interior on their behalf is that this is not about race, although the children may racially, be different than their white parents. This is about sovereignty. And some of those terms and ways of thinking are possibly unfamiliar to our church members, to our viewers today. And so wondering if you could lead us a little further down that path of understanding, what does it mean to be not just a Christian and a cultural practitioner, but truly a citizen of two nations?
Yeah, I think as much as I've done so much community work, I can remember, I forget how many cycles of voter registration drives, Rock the Native Vote. I was one of the founders of that movement that I'm not affiliated with it this time around. There's so many different things that have tied into our connection with this country. Even there is a respect for even our service people that have served in the military. I think of my own grandfather who served 14 months in a German prisoner of war camp in World War II and survived. Now he was forever changed by that, but he survived for the benefit of this entire country. And there's others. I think the thing that we always talk about around Veterans Day is that no other race of people in the U.S. serves more per capita than Native American people. Yeah. So I think about respecting all of those gifts for my well-being of these warriors out there, men and women, young people today of that. So I'm reverent in that respect as we think about the laws that have been established in this land very recently in terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act. And I don't know how that act came about, and I'm actually thankful that it did, though, because simply put, is that every child that is born into our communities has a right to exist as our ancestors did. Acknowledging the boarding schools, acknowledging all of that thing. And even what I didn't talk about is even acknowledging, because this is in the background of ICWA, which is what they call the Indian Child Welfare Act. In the background is that there was a commodification of the adoption agencies of taking children and selling them to whoever, of making money from that process during that same boarding school era. That's the environment that it comes out of. But then also that we also have acknowledged today the intergenerational harm that we are doing when you take someone out of their very identity of who they are, their clan lineage, their understanding of the cosmos, the ancestors that have brought them forward, a way of existing, a denying of a religious articulation day in and day out. Like I talked about, going into the first snow, there's other things, and there's 1,000 things that we do, that the harm that it creates upon a person generationally, that when you take a child into a home that has no idea of that understanding of their existence, every body part that we have to be accountable for when we go back to our ancestors upon our death, all of these things that we navigate from our tribal communities, from the umbilical cord to if we lose an amputee or something, all of these things that we think about, that's just a small part of it. The coming of age ceremonies, the death rituals, the coming into the age of being a warrior, all of these things, we still have processes in place. And that's not even taking into consideration the day-to-day practices of well-being and health. You've taken a child out of that and saying, well, that's not as important as if another community can do that. And so today, I've been asked this question many times, going all the way back, and I think it's getting close to almost a decade ago, when the Veronica Brown case was taking across the news across the country, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, Stephanie, that I was a part of one of our protest movements, because no matter what, you can take us to boarding schools, you can take us to other families. There's going to be a day and time when we come back and we'll ask the questions that, who am I? Who is it that, who are my ancestors? Who are the people that I come from? What was our creation story? What is our right to exist? And to be honest, this goes even beyond the human species, is that this world and this earth will talk to us if we listen. These animal relatives out there will talk to us if we listen, because we're not a superior species. That's where we've gone wrong. So there's always going to be something that calls us back to who we are. And that's when my hope is that harm won't occur, because that's why Indian Child Welfare Act is in place, is in hopes of lessening that harm when a child is removed from that identity, from that understanding of this world. And so that's what I try to get our own people to understand, is that we should get to a place where we don't have that anymore, because we're taking care of our children. Because we have enough capacity in many ways. Now that's a whole nother, I don't want to go off into a different tangent, but I keep saying is that our people need to stay with our people so that we can speak the languages of our ancestors, so we can exist as our ancestors. But then also, and I don't spend time recording or analyzing. There's too many of these court cases across the country. There's too many of these. There's too many of these. How shall we say it? Attacks on the sovereignty of a people.
Yeah.
That
and this is a very strategic attack. There is dark money at play. This is about more than just removing this child or not removing this child. This is really, I think, there are oil companies with money behind this. It's about removing tribal sovereignty so that extractive industries ultimately have access to water, land, all of those things you've been talking about. Sorry to interrupt you, but just that's the last wider context.
That's the last point that I want to make, is that it's not for the well-being of that child. It's being supported by an industry that wants what sovereign communities have: resources, the ability to access these so-called resources, all of these things, so it can continue to deteriorate that relationship that nations have with the United States. Now, I'm always going to be skeptical of the concept of sovereignty, because I don't need a United States Congress to define the sovereignty as an Indigenous person. I know that. I have my clan understanding of what my responsibilities are. I have my ancestors telling me what I'm supposed to be doing. I have my elders that surround me and say, I don't need permission from a document that is issued by the government to say how I should exist. But at the same time, we've been in this partnership. We've walked together, and there's a lot of harm that can come out of isolating oneself from each other. And so we have to acknowledge that sovereignty is only a passage of Congress away from being lost. That all they have to do is pass a law, and it's not the same anymore. And so that's what I'm always hoping, is that people will always respect the agreements that they've made with our communities, with our Indigenous tribes, and respect that. But at the end of the day, true sovereignty will come down into our hearts and who we exist, how we exist. How do we treat our children? How do we treat our elders? How do we treat this earth? That's where the true sovereignty comes. I had mentioned even, earlier in this conversation, I spent time in Germany back in August and September. And I said, well, I'm going to stay there and I want you to use me as much as I can. So I was there 16 days because I didn't believe that it's not worth it to just fly me over there for one thing and fly me back. There's too much of a carbon footprint. There's too much of a harm to this earth. I said, so I want to make sure I stay there and I can work. I can share with people, understanding that existence. And so that's what true sovereignty is understanding that. And today, what we have to realize is that there's so many powers that be, or so-called powers that be, at work, putting money behind these initiatives, when is it really our children that they're thinking about? So my hope is that ICWA will always be there. But my broader hope is that maybe there will be a day when we don't have to have ICWA, in this sense, that our people will always be home, will have a place here, so they're not under threat of being taken out. There will not be a necessity to have federal law in place. But right now we have to have it. We have to have that sovereignty respected, because our tribes are really leading this country in the preservation of this earth and doing some work to try to bring that to the forefront of our communities. And unfortunately, though, in my home state of Oklahoma, it's probably one of the battleground states between tribal communities and elected officials.
Thank you so much.
Chebon, I'm going to begin to share some of the questions that have been put forward in the Q&A. And I'm going to group a couple of them together that are related to the United Methodist Church specifically. And as I do so, in your response, feel free to be mindful that many of our participants may not be United Methodist and may not know some of the references that I'll be noting in these questions. So feel free to provide some broader education for those who might not be aware of some of these United Methodist specific initiatives or terms. So two related questions. The first, from Wesley White, is asking Chebon about your evaluation of the formal acts of repentance of the UMC voted on at General Conference. A second question is from Jean Green, which is framed by an acknowledgement of the work that's taken place in Canada to recognize the harm done to First Nations peoples and to listen to survivors of the residential school movement. And so Jean's question is, what initiatives are underway in the United Methodist Church to examine and own the church's role in the boarding school movement? So a particular question about the formal acts of repentance at General Conference, and then more broadly, initiatives in the UMC related to the boarding school movement.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And I'll take the first one over here, and it's in my chat, so I'm looking to the right here or left to some, to just for reference. And so the evaluation of the formal acts of repentance in the United Methodist Church, maybe it's been many, many years, over a decade ago, that an initiative was started to acknowledge these harms that we've been talking about, how denominations have a dual culpability, so to speak, with the US government in the history of the treatment of Native American Indigenous peoples. And so they acknowledged that, and they wanted to start a moment of what do we do to have reconciliation? What do we do to acknowledge this? And the first thing that I said is that I won't use the term reconciliation, because reconciliation takes on a whole nother direction of equity between denominations and Indigenous peoples that I don't think we'll be able to, nobody is willing to go that far in truly reconciling when we are looked upon as equals and as each other. So I won't even let them use that term. But to give them, I did issue a report. It wasn't published. I was housed under an agency within the United Methodist Church, our missions agency, and I did do a report on those out of the, I think, 52 regional areas of the United States, continental United States, that were asked to do different types of work with acknowledging this history. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 22 actually did some type of engagement. It's been a few years since I've done that. And even those 22, it ranged from anywhere just from correspondence to myself, because I was the head of this of initiative, I guess you could say, for our denomination, to others who did a full onset of activities, of education moments, of worship services to actually show repentance, all of these kinds of things. So as a whole, the United Methodist Church, I would give them a C minus, maybe a D plus. And I did put that behind each regional area. I gave them a grade. That's probably why it didn't get published across the country. I think I have that report somewhere in my files. But I would say, somewhere in that area, because we did have some movement. I even hosted our Council of Bishops here in Oklahoma City during that time, and I brought in 4 Indigenous women leaders to talk about different areas of importance to the life of Indigenous people: sovereignty of food, the rights of Indigenous women, the rights of our languages, and all of that. And I had all of these primarily male Episcopal bishop leaders sitting there listening for 3 hours, our elders of our community. So we did things like that. In other areas, other regions, they did similar things that I think had an impact. And even, I do think it prepared us for what we're going through now. But I will say this, and I hosted them in, I think it was 2015, maybe 14, in Oklahoma City. I was talking about boarding schools then, and it did not begin any institutional conversations about transparency and acknowledgement. Now, because we've actually found cemeteries, and because of the placement of Secretary Deb Haaland in place, we're at a moment that we're holding them accountable. So that's the answer to that first question. The second one, I'll go on down to the last part of it. What initiatives are underway in the United Methodist Church to acknowledge the connection with boarding schools? Is that those same questions that I shared maybe 30 minutes ago, that's what we're trying to determine. If you were to read the report that came from Secretary Haaland's office, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I think, you would see in there sporadically in that document, 100-page document, that they didn't have the resources to go and do the necessary research, because there's files in holding places all over the country that no one has paid attention to, primary resources where, maybe an acknowledgement of a cemetery might be there, might be not. All of this is spread out, and it's kind of chaotic doing the research. They acknowledge that in that report. And so what I said to our denomination is that we need to take the work away from the government and say, here's where our responsibility is. This is our connection to that. And because we're in the middle of a schism within the Methodist Church and some other things that are going on, even we're recovering from the pandemic, from loss of donations because of offerings, that kind of thing, that we're still recovering. It's kind of slowed the process down, because we all had to get into the same room and talk about it. But right at this moment, there is research being done saying, here's what our connection is to X, Y, and Z schools, the number of schools that are there. And we're trying to get to a point, funding has been put in place to find the appropriate researchers that will help us to give that disclosure to the rest of the country and saying, here's where our connection was to these schools, and to give that full understanding of even access to what lands we have. If there's a tribal community that wants to come in and do some type of research, to allow that to happen, to facilitate that. And even we most likely will come across even confidential information that might even come into the area of NAGPRA, Native American graves and repatriation. So it's not going to be public knowledge, but that's where we're in that moment of doing that now at this very moment in time. And I'm actually thankful, because my hope is that once that is established, that report with what we can make public, and I'm hoping that's going to be by the end of next year, then we start looking at the reparative action. What do we do now? How do you support the work collectively as a Christian faith? We have language programs that are out there. We have programs that are trying to understand our existence on this earth. We have all of these grassroots movements of people trying to put the pieces of a cosmology back in place. Can you not work with our people to protect and to affirm and to even underwrite the things that we're trying to do? And heaven forbid, at the end of the day, is it so hard to give land back to communities, to people? Is it too hard? What is the deal? Give land back. And that's one of the things that I've been sharing with us. And we'll figure it out. Let us figure it out, what we do with that land. How do we rematriate that land? That's what, when I go back to my homelands in this forest in Atlanta that I'm a part of, I say, give us that chance to rematriate, to let her remember us and us to remember her in our time there. Don't tear her down before we even had that chance. Don't destroy this earth before we even have that chance. In the words of Vine Deloria, we are the spiritual landowners of these territories here. We have a right to exist, and that right to be on these territories isn't defined by a piece of paper. It's defined by our birth story into creation. And so that's what my hope is. And let me just make sure so that's what we're in the middle of. And I'm going to be a thorn in the side of the ecumenical community, the interfaith community, saying this is what justice looks like. This is what equity looks like. This is how we recover from dispossession. And just a last note, in that government report, dispossession of land is behind so many of the initiatives when the boarding school era was initiated. It was to get to our territories. It was to get us out of the way so what has happened in history would happen.
Chebon, there's another question I want us to turn toward in the chat, but briefly, let me follow up on this particular conversation for our United Methodist participants today, layperson, clergy, staff member at a border agency, who is convicted by what you've shared and their growing awareness of the history of the boarding schools, who are committed to doing as you've invited, which is to press for a deeper accounting of those histories with specifics, and then movement toward reparative action oriented perhaps specifically around land and the return of land. Where would you direct them, or how would you direct them? Would you invite them to turn to the Native American Comprehensive Plan, which you direct? Would you turn them to Episcopal leadership to begin pressing a particular border agency? How might efforts to put pressure at the denominational level, where might those energies be directed?
Yeah, I think in the United Methodist Church specifically, it would be directed towards two entities in particular. One would be my office of the Native American Comprehensive Plan, but also we have an advocacy entity out there, a caucus that does a lot of the work as well, the Native American International Caucus. That would be a wonderful opportunity. to have some of these conversations so that we can start conceptualizing what are the possibilities. Because right now we're coming out of an era that I'm not even so sure is over, where we get doors closed on our faces, where it takes months and months to establish a meeting with Episcopal leaders. I've heard clergy, Native American clergy, say that to me day in and day out, that this is the era that we're coming out of, even as we celebrate, Reverend David Wilson in the United Methodist Church becoming the first United Methodist bishop just this past about a month ago, I think. So we're hoping that this can be something that is established from here on, as we have that conversation to conceptualize. Even as I do my work with universities and seminaries across the country, my first question is, how far do you want to go? Because my hope is through that will go as far as it takes to get true balance, to get true equity there. And so those two entities are there. I will say, because it's a moment of what we call intergenerational / historical trauma, that our communities were really fragmented because we're all at different places in that recovery process. We have, like I said, 501c3s that if we see one, we can partner with that. The White Bison organization is one that does intergenerational trauma recovery. I've used them in the past for a few things. There's other language initiatives, all of these things that this moment in time kind of attacked, I think is what my hope is, that we can have that conversation. But the question really is there because I had historically heard comments like, well, we have no Native American people in our regions, or we have no Native American people. Well, that's not true, because every state we're there. We're not acknowledged. And so my hope is it starts with those communities that are right next door to us, that we can say, how do we reestablish that? How do we respect the work that has been done over the decades? And then out of those conversations, we establish, where do we walk in parallel with each other as we start this existence? And my hope is that it's not I should have said this at the beginning, it's not a missionary endeavor. I'm not sitting here trying to establish new churches. I'm not sitting here trying to convert people to Christianity. I'm just trying to make right this harm in history. And in fact, that should be what we are about, is removing harm from our existence today. And so I've always been critical of even my own denomination that I serve today, because I'll sit here and I'll say, oh, well, we have scholarships available, but you have to be a Methodist to get those scholarships. Or, oh, we'll give you this, we'll give you water, but are you a Christian? It doesn't, that's not how we exist. Is that if we're making things well, if we're removing the harm, are we not called to just give? And that's what I speak to all of our Methodist institutions out there, is that we should be in the business of making this world a better place for all of creation. So a little bit of a long answer, Tim, to that question.
Chebon, there is another question. This question from Fernando, who is one of our participants, who is from Africa, saying, I would like to know how you, I think he means, your community, your tribe, you are transferring your heritage, culture, and skills to the younger generation beyond just what your children are learning at home. Do they learn at schools? Do you have Native American history at schools? This is so inspiring and new to me.
Thank you, Fernando. I appreciate that question. It almost brings tears to my eyes thinking about that, because the answer to the question, I'll start with the second half, is that it's not done sufficiently in school systems. Our children are required to go to school. My children are at school right now. And they don't hear every day the beauty of who they are as Indigenous peoples, about their communities, the languages, the clan understandings, our existence, our understanding of birth, our understanding of death. They don't hear that every day. Maybe once in a while in the month of November, when the US likes to recognize Native American History Month, we might have something that's there. So we have to take it upon ourselves to do extra. So not just for our families, but for our communities as a whole. So before the COVID-19 pandemic, I was teaching cultural classes to a greater community here in the Oklahoma City area for anybody who wanted to come. And so we would come, we would do our dances, we would talk about pieces of the cosmology. Like I said, some things are private, but we would go and share that little thing. And one of the questions I would always ask the parents and the children that would come, I would say, how many times today has your child, have they been able to hear something in our language? Have they heard something about their clan lineage, the creation story? And every time I asked that question, nobody raised their hand. So I tried to remove that. And so as much as I am, I don't know how to say it. I'm pretty worn out from just going from place to place, trying to teach our people and to teach the world about the right to exist as Indigenous peoples. I'd make myself available anytime I get a chance to teach our school systems. The Moore Public Schools, which is a suburb of the bigger municipality of Oklahoma City. I've done an education back in November. I did an educational night for them. All of our school systems. I've done training for the one of the school systems in the city of Atlanta, the DeKalb school systems, for their social studies, civics teachers on how they understand Native American peoples. I've gone all over the place where the doors were open to try to teach that broader community, how do we understand that? And so that's what my hope is that as opposed to allowing missionary entities to come in and say, well, you have to leave all that behind. You have to remove that type of Indigenous regalia, Indigenous understanding of existence behind, that we come in and say, because it has been here, it has a beauty. Because it has been in existence for so long, it has a beauty. And that my hope is that we can continue to share that with our children so that there's never, ever one of our young people that has shame for who they are. And I was blessed this past fall. We have a nationwide educators association that hosted their conference. I think there was about 1,000 people there here in the city of Oklahoma, and they asked me to give a blessing for that. Before they even started, they said, will you come up here and pray for us? I didn't know there was going to be that many people. I said, well, you asked me to pray, I pray. I'm a praying person. I don't mind doing that. So I went up there, man. There's chairs all the way back. It's a big old hall. But I went up to us and I talked the way people have talked to me, my elders. And I said, an expression was made for this prayer. And I'm going to come here and I'm going to say something for you educators, Native American educators out there. And I said, one of the things I prayed for is that all of our children, every word that would go into their ear will be something that affirms who they are, affirms the beauty of who they are as an Indigenous person. That's what my hope is for all of us across the world, is that we don't have that shame. And so I carry that prayer even to that question that's answered, or that question that was asked.
Chebon, this has been incredibly rich and profound and inspiring. And if we had another 3 hours, I have no doubt we could continue to go even deeper. And I look forward to opportunities to continue the conversation and the work with you. Before we close, let me just invite you, if there are any final words, any insights, any invitations that you haven't shared with us that you'd like to share before we do.
I don't think off the top of my head, I don't think I have any. I have a little tear in my eye because the things that we do, they mean so much for all of our people. The things that we carry, that we don't even know we carry as Indigenous peoples, that we have a right to exist. We have a right to, there was a time when we were assimilated, but my hope is that in this era of existence, we re-assimilate the rest of the world back to the identity that we were able to preserve, of walking together, in all the chaos of colonizing identity, everything that has happened. My hope is that we can continue to build the future together so that these harms don't exist anymore. And even as I stand here, I'll be the first to always say that there's others that can speak before me. And if people are called to listen to those voices, I won't ever come in the way of that. I'll go and I'll recluse myself. But my hope is that there'll be enough voices for us to hear so that we can construct that future together. We can acknowledge what's happened, but we can embrace those pieces of our identity that we still have. And that's what I think is the work of all people, not just a religion, but all of us. That's what we're trying to do today, to understand who we are. I think there was a meme or something going around social media that talks about, this is the identity that they made you to believe who you are. And now the time is to come back to remember who our ancestors told us who we are. And in essence, our understanding of God, who God told us we are. And so that's what my hope is that the work that we do together will do that. And for those in the global north, this is the cold time of year when we celebrate this, for those that are Christians, this kind of Christmas season. I know the global south is in a different moment in time, but we all have moments that in this particular understanding of the calendar that is special during this time. And to recognize the sacred nature of the special energy that surrounds creation and just be obedient to it. When we see generosity prevailing, when we see forgiveness prevailing, when we see prayers prevailing, it's okay to live that way every day. It's okay to do that, when we flip seasons again. But the time has come to realize the reverence of this earth and each other. And that's what my hope is that we do, that we respect this energy of life that surrounds us. So Mado Jage Just Jay. Thank you.
Chebon, I give thanks to you. I give thanks for your mother on this day of her birth. I give thanks for your grandmothers, for all your ancestors. I give thanks for all the relations who have supported and nourished and guided and taught you and sustained you in your work, in your vocation, in your teaching, in your organizing, in your pleas, in your prayers. You have taught us richly over this last hour and a half, and we join you in your work. We join you in your hopes and your vision for the re-assimilation of all peoples into harmony, into balance, into peace with one another and with the earth. Thank you again for your time, for who you are, and for all that you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stephanie, thank you as a friend, as a colleague, as co-chair of the Indigenous Study Committee for your role, not just in this webinar, but in all of them. Dr. Ott, for the ongoing support of the Stead Center, for your personal involvement in this work, and to all those who joined us today and who may listen to this webinar at another time. Thank you for spending the time with us to learn, and please do continue to join with us wherever you are in this important work of just repair. This webinar will be posted on Garrett's Indigenous Study Committee webpage. Please feel free to share this with others in a variety of formats. And if we can be helpful to you in your work, please feel free to reach out. Again, blessings and gratitude to each on this panel and to all who've joined us today.